Forgiveness was a luxury Ewan Carmichael simply could not afford. He swore upon his father's grave to entirely obliterate the Harrington family, erasing their stolen wealth and legacy from history. But retribution remains a highly dangerous game, especially when the pawn destined for sacrifice unexpectedly captures your fiercely guarded heart. London society in the autumn of 1854 was a masquerade of silk champagne and whispered scandals. Behind the gilded doors of Mayfair fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card or the signing of a speculative railway contract. But for Ewan Carmichael, the 9th Duke of Kinross, London, was not a playground. It was a hunting ground. 10 years prior, the Carmichael family had been stripped of their dignity, their ancestral lands, and their fortune. Ewan's father, Jamie, a proud but overly trusting Highland Duke, had entered into a joint venture with Lord William Harrington to build a vital railway line through the Glengarry Pass. It was meant to bring prosperity to a starving region. Instead, it brought utter devastation. Lord Harrington, utilizing a labyrinth of forged documents, hidden clauses, and corrupt London barristers, orchestrated a hostile takeover of the venture. He seized the Carmichael lands as collateral for manufactured debts. Jamie Carmichael died less than a year later, officially of consumption, but Ewan knew the truth. His father had died of a broken heart, suffocated by the shame of ruin. Ewan had not wept at the funeral. Instead, he had packed a single trunk, sailed to the shipyards of Boston, and spent a grueling decade building a merciless shipping empire in the Atlantic. Now he had returned to Britain not just as a duke, but as a titan of industry, with a singular burning objective, the absolute and total annihilation of the Harrington family. He did not simply want to kill Lord William Harrington. He wanted him to live long enough to watch his legacy burn to ashes. While Ewan plotted in the shadows, Isabel Harrington was fighting her own desperate war within the walls of Highfield Manor, the family's sprawling Hampshire estate. At 22, Isabel possessed a sharp mathematical mind and a quiet, unyielding grace that masked a terrifying reality. Her father, Lord William, had not let his stolen wealth bring him peace. Guilt and greed had driven him into the dark embrace of opium and reckless gambling. Isabel was the only thing holding the crumbling Harrington facade together. Every morning before the servants awoke, she sat in the frigid library, desperately manipulating the household ledgers, trying to stretch their dwindling funds to feed the staff and protect her younger siblings, 10-year-old Edward and 8-year-old Mary. She knew her father was drowning in debt, but she did not know that a predator was swimming in those same waters, buying up every promissory note mortgage and gambling marker bearing the Harrington signature. The trap snapped shut on a freezing November evening. Lord Harrington was hosting a lavish, desperate ball at Highfield Manor, a final illusion of prosperity to secure a wealthy marriage for Isabel. The ballroom was a sea of twirling waltzes and glittering chandeliers. Isabel stood by the grand staircase, forcing a polite smile for suitors she despised, when the heavy oak doors of the manor swung open, silencing the orchestra. Ewan Carmichael stepped into the light. He was a stark contrast to the powdered dandies of London. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in immaculate, severe black tailoring, he carried the rugged, dangerous air of the northern mountains. A collective gasp rippled through the older aristocrats, who recognized the face of the boy they thought had been banished to obscurity. Ewan did not look at the crowd. His ice-blue eyes locked onto Lord William Harrington, who had gone ashen pale, his crystal glass slipping from his trembling fingers to shatter on the marble floor. "Lord Harrington," Ewan's voice boomed, rich and chillingly calm, cutting through the silence. "I believe the music has stopped, and so has your line of credit." Before the entire assembly of London's elite, Ewan systematically laid out the truth. He produced a thick leather folio containing every debt William owed. He had purchased the mortgages on Highfield Manor, the deeds to the remaining coal mines, and the catastrophic gambling debts held by London's most ruthless moneylenders, including the notorious Josiah Croft. By the laws of this kingdom, your estates, your assets, and your very freedom belong to me, Ewan declared, his voice devoid of mercy. You have until dawn to vacate this property before I summon the magistrates to drag you to debtor's prison. William collapsed, clutching his chest in a pathetic heap. The guests began to flee, eager to escape the stench of a ruined house. But as Ewan turned to leave, a voice stopped him. Wait. It was Isabel. She stepped forward, stepping over the shattered glass, her chin held high, despite the terror screaming in her chest. She had heard the whispers of her father's past sins, though she had never known the full truth of the Carmichael betrayal. Now staring at the imposing Duke, she saw the sheer gravity of his hatred. Your Grace, Isabel said, her voice remarkably steady. Throwing a sick old man into the Fleet prison will not resurrect your father, nor will seizing an empty house satisfy a debt of this magnitude. Ewan narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to her. He had expected tears, hysterics, or begging. He had not expected this fierce, quiet defiance. And what would you suggest, Miss Harrington? Shall I simply forgive the man who slaughtered my family's name? No, she replied, her gaze unwavering. I suggest a compromise. My brother and sister are innocent in this feud. Leave them a modest stipend to live and be educated in a quiet country cottage. In exchange, you take everything else: the manor, the mines, the titles. She took a deep breath, offering her final desperate chip. And me. Ewan stopped. You. I am the sole manager of this estate. I know every ledger, every tenant, every failing crop. I will sign over my independence. I will come to your Highland estate. I will work as your clerk, your estate manager, your servant, whatever you require. I will spend the rest of my life working to repay the physical debt my father owes you, provided you spare my siblings the trauma of the streets. Ewan stared at her. His plan had been perfect. He had envisioned total destruction, yet looking at Isabel, a new darker thought took hold. What better revenge than to take William Harrington's prized daughter, the jewel of London society, and subject her to a life of hard labour in the unforgiving isolation of the Scottish Highlands. He wanted to break the Harrington spirit, and breaking the daughter seemed far more satisfying than watching the father rot. Very well, Ewan whispered, his voice like grinding stones. Pack a single trunk, Miss Harrington. We leave for Kinross Castle at first light. Welcome to your new prison. The journey north was a brutal endurance test. For 5 days the carriage battered its way through sleet and freezing rain, leaving the manicured lawns of England far behind. Inside the dark leather confines of the coach, the silence between Ewan and Isabel was heavy and suffocating. Ewan watched her from the corner of his eye, waiting for her to complain about the cold, the terrible food at the coaching inns, or the cruelty of her fate. She never did. Isabel sat upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a mask of stoic acceptance. She was terrified, far removed from everything she knew, but she drew strength from the knowledge that Edward and Mary were safe in a small cottage, funded by the bitter bargain she had struck. Kinross Castle rose from the mist like a jagged obsidian tooth against the grey Highland sky. It was an ancient, sprawling fortress of dark stone, perched dangerously on the edge of a roaring loch. It was magnificent, but it was cold, isolated, and incredibly lonely. Upon arrival, Ewan handed her over to his severe housekeeper, Mrs. MacFarlane, and his fiercely loyal steward, Duncan Fraser. Ewan's orders were explicit. Isabel was not a guest. She was an indentured servant working off a massive debt. She was given a drafty room in the servants' wing and put to work immediately. Ewan intentionally assigned her the most grueling administrative tasks, hoping to crush her spirit. He handed her decades of neglected, chaotic ledgers from the Carmichael estate records that had fallen into ruin during his long absence. He expected her to fail to break down, sobbing over the impossible mathematics of a massive agricultural estate. Instead, Isabel thrived. Stripped of the suffocating social expectations of London, Isabel found solace in the cold, hard logic of numbers. She worked by candlelight until her fingers were stained with ink and her eyes ached. Within 3 weeks, she had not only organized the chaotic accounts, but had identified massive inefficiencies in the estate's grain distribution. She presented her findings to Duncan Fraser, mapping out a new crop rotation system that would save the Duke hundreds of pounds before the spring thaw. Duncan, initially deeply suspicious of the Harrington woman, found himself begrudgingly impressed. He reported her progress to Ewan. "She has a mind like a steel trap, Your Grace," Duncan muttered one evening in Ewan's study, pouring a glass of whiskey. "She's working harder than 3 of my clerks combined. And the staff, they are beginning to soften to her. She patched up the scullery maid's burnt hand yesterday without a word of complaint." Ewan clenched his jaw, staring into the roaring fire. This was not the plan. She was supposed to be miserable, arrogant, and easily broken. Her resilience infuriated him primarily because it forced him to respect her. Every time he crossed paths with her in the drafty corridors wrapped in a simple woolen shawl, her chin raised in that quiet, dignified manner, he felt a dangerous crack forming in the armor of his hatred. The true turning point arrived in the dead of winter, brought forth by a ghost from the past. Ewan had ordered Isabel to clear out the old archives in the West Tower, a damp, freezing room filled with forgotten trunks. While sorting through water-damaged correspondence, Isabel discovered a heavy, wax-sealed box hidden beneath a false floorboard. Inside were the original unredacted contracts regarding the Glengarry railway venture. Sitting on the dusty floor holding her breath, Isabel read through the documents. She compared the signatures, the dates, the secret addendums. The terrifying reality washed over her like ice water. She had known her father was weak, a gambler, a man who squandered wealth. But she had always believed his wealth was legally his. The papers in her trembling hands proved otherwise. They were explicit proof that Lord William Harrington had systematically forged Jamie Carmichael's signatures, intentionally bankrupted the Duke, and effectively stolen the lands that had funded Isabel's entire privileged upbringing. The beautiful gowns she had worn, the tutors who had educated her, the food she had eaten, it was all paid for with Carmichael blood. The crushing weight of the guilt was absolute. That night, Ewan was working late in his study, when a soft knock broke the silence. Isabel entered. She did not look like the stoic, unbreakable woman she had been for the past 2 months. She looked utterly shattered. Her eyes were red, her face ghostly pale, and her hands shook violently as she walked to his desk and placed the bundle of historical documents down. Ewan looked at the papers, recognizing his father's handwriting, and then looked up at her, his jaw tightening. "Where did you find these?" "In the West Tower." Isabel whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't try to defend her father. She didn't try to make excuses. Instead, she fell to her knees, right there in the Duke's study, the heavy velvet of her skirt pooling around her on the floor. "I didn't know," she sobbed, the dam of her composure finally breaking. The tears she had held back since the night of the London ball spilled over. "I swear to you on my life, you and I didn't know the depth of what he did to your family. I thought we were just paying off gambling debts. I didn't know my very existence was built on your father's grave." Ewan froze. He had fantasized for 10 years about a Harrington on their knees, begging for mercy. He had imagined the triumph, the vindication, but seeing Isabel, the woman who had quietly endured his cruelty, who had worked tirelessly to improve his estate, so utterly broken by the sins of a father she couldn't control, brought him no joy. It brought a sickening, hollow feeling to his stomach. "Stand up, Isabel," he commanded softly, the venom gone from his voice. "I cannot." She wept, covering her face. "Keep me here forever. Let me rot in this castle. I deserve it. My family deserves it." In a completely uncharacteristic move, Ewan rounded the desk, knelt on the floor beside her, and firmly grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You are not your father." He said the words, shocking even himself. Before the fragile truce could be navigated, the heavy oak door of the study flew open. Duncan stood in the doorway, snow blowing in from the hallway behind him. "Your Grace, Miss Isabel!" Duncan yelled over the howling wind outside. "It's a massive blizzard." The roof at the MacDonald tenant farm just collapsed under the snow. The family is trapped inside, and the roads are totally impassable. There was no time for ancient feuds or guilt. Survival in the Highlands demanded immediate action. Ewan ordered horses saddled despite the deadly conditions. To his shock, Isabel did not retreat to her room. She rushed to the infirmary, packed a satchel with bandages, splints, and medicinal alcohol, and ran out to the courtyard, mounting a horse beside him in the screaming wind. "Go back inside. It's suicide!" Ewan roared over the storm. "They are your people, which means they are my responsibility now." Isabel shouted back, her eyes fierce. They rode blindly through the whiteout, trusting the horses to find the path. When they reached the ruined farmhouse, it was a scene of chaos. Ewan and Duncan tore at the fallen timber with their bare hands, hauling the freezing MacDonald family out of the wreckage. Isabel was instantly on her knees in the snow, working with calm, lightning speed. She set a broken leg for the father and wrapped the youngest child, a boy named Jamie, in her own heavy wool cloak, holding him to her chest to share her body heat, while Ewan dug out the rest of their belongings. It was dawn before they managed to transport the injured family back to the safety of Kinross Castle. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, and shivering violently, Ewan and Isabel found themselves alone in the castle's massive kitchen. Ewan had built a roaring fire in the hearth. He watched Isabel as she sat on a wooden bench, her hair plastered to her face, her hands raw and bleeding from the frozen wood, staring blankly into the flames. She had risked her life tonight. Not for her family, not for a debt, but because it was the right thing to do. Ewan walked over to her, carrying a heavy wool blanket. He draped it over her trembling shoulders. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a vulnerability that tore through the last remaining walls of his defenses. "You are freezing," she whispered, noticing his shivering frame. Instinctively, without thinking of the debt, the feud, or the past, Ewan knelt before her. He reached out and gently took her raw, freezing hands in his own, rubbing them to generate warmth. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity through them both. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly thick. Ewan looked at her bruised, exhausted face, dirt smudged across her cheek, and realized with terrifying clarity that the hatred he had nurtured for a decade was gone. In its place was a fierce, consuming admiration, and a desire so profound it made his chest ache. "Isabel," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't plan it. He couldn't stop it. Ewan leaned in, closing the distance between them, and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, fueled by the adrenaline of the storm, the shattering of his vows, and the raw realization that the woman he had sworn to destroy was the only woman he would ever love. Isabel gasped her hands instinctively, clutching the lapels of his soaked coat, and to his absolute shock, she kissed him back, surrendering to the chaotic, terrifying warmth blooming between them in the heart of the freezing Scottish winter. But a kiss in the dark could not erase a decade of blood feud and London was not yet finished with the Duke of Kinross. Springtime broke through the frozen grip of the Scottish mountains, mirroring the dramatic thaw within Kinross Castle. For 3 months following the blizzard, the bitter feud that had defined Ewan Carmichael's existence dissolved into a quiet, fiercely protected devotion. Isabel was no longer a prisoner of debt. She was the heartbeat of the estate. They spent their evenings in the library, no longer separated by icy silence, but working shoulder to shoulder, their hands occasionally brushing over maps of the Baltic Sea trade routes. Ewan had entrusted her with the ledgers of his Atlantic shipping empire, a fleet that was currently supplying essential cargo to Admiral Charles Napier's naval campaigns against the Russian Empire. However, London society possesses a long, venomous memory, and the ghosts of Mayfair rarely stay buried. April brought a torrential downpour, and with it a black carriage bearing the crest of the Royal Courts of Justice. It rattled over the cobblestone courtyard, shattering the fragile peace Ewan and Isabel had constructed. From the carriage stepped Lord Charles Cunningham, a ruthless corporate barrister, and a former silent partner to Isabel's father. Cunningham was a man who traded in human desperation, and he carried a satchel thick with legal warrants, sanctioned by the Home Secretary himself, Lord Palmerston. Isabel stood frozen in the grand hall as Cunningham stomped the mud from his boots, his eyes scanning the stone walls with utter disdain. Ewan descended the grand staircase, his face instantly hardening into a mask of pure, lethal granite. Duncan Fraser flanked him, a heavy hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword. "Carmichael!" Cunningham sneered, holding up a rolled parchment. "I have not travelled to this god-forsaken wilderness for my health. I bring grim news, and I bring the Queen's law." Cunningham unceremoniously announced that Lord William Harrington had succumbed to a fatal overdose of laudanum in a squalid London boarding house. Isabel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Despite her father's catastrophic sins and the ruin he had brought upon her, a sharp, ragged spike of grief pierced her chest. Ewan instinctively moved to her side, wrapping a protective arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Keep your hands off my property, Your Grace." Cunningham snapped his lip, curling. Ewan's voice dropped to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "Choose your next words with extreme caution, Cunningham, or you will not leave this valley breathing." Unfazed, the barrister unrolled the parchment. Before his unseemly demise, Lord Harrington accrued a massive secondary debt, a fraudulent speculation scheme involving the Grand Crimean Central Railway. He embezzled funds directly from investors tied to the War Office. To avoid the hangman's noose, Harrington signed a legally binding contract 2 days before his death. He signed over his only remaining unencumbered asset to settle the debt. His daughter. Cunningham smiled, displaying yellowed teeth. "Isabel Harrington is legally betrothed to me. Furthermore, as her husband-to-be and legal guardian, I am here to collect her along with the £50,000 she has allegedly earned while illegally indentured to this estate. If you resist Duke, I have a writ from the magistrates to seize your ships currently docked in Portsmouth, crippling your supply lines to the Baltic fleet. You will face charges of treason for impeding the war effort." The trap was immaculate. It was a flawless legal extortion scheme. Isabel felt the blood drain entirely from her face. She looked at Ewan, seeing the veins bulging in his neck, the sheer murderous rage radiating from his large frame. She knew Ewan's shipping empire was his life's work. It was the fortune he had bled for in Boston, the power that had allowed him to reclaim his ancestral home. If he fought Cunningham, he would lose everything he had built. He would be ruined a second time by a Harrington. "I will go," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. She stepped away from Ewan's embrace, though it took every ounce of her strength. "I will not let my father's final sin destroy you, Ewan. You have built an empire. I am merely a clerk." "You are not going anywhere," Ewan roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings like thunder. "I must," she cried, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "He has the law, Ewan. He will take your ships. He will brand you a traitor. I will not be the anchor that drags you into the abyss." Cunningham stepped forward, reaching out to grab Isabel's wrist. "A sensible girl. Fetch your cloak, Isabel. We ride for Edinburgh immediately." Before Cunningham's fingers could even brush her skin, Ewan moved with the terrifying speed of a Highland predator. He seized Cunningham by the throat, lifting the portly barrister entirely off his feet. Cunningham choked his face, turning a mottled purple as he clawed helplessly at Ewan's iron grip. "Duncan!" Ewan commanded, his eyes burning with a dark, unholy fire. "Fetch the lockbox from the West Tower, the one with my father's original railway contracts." Chaos erupted violently inside the ancient stone walls of Kinross Castle. Panicked carriage drivers instinctively reached for their loaded muskets, but Duncan Fraser had already drawn his massive broadsword. He stood firm, levelling gleaming steel at the heavy oak door, daring any foolish man to cross his path. Within mere moments, Duncan returned from the freezing West Tower, slapping a heavy sealed iron lockbox forcefully onto the long dining table. Ewan ruthlessly hurled Lord Charles Cunningham to the hard stone floor. The terrified barrister gasped desperately for air, coughing violently as he scrambled frantically backward like a cornered rat. "You speak of royal law, Cunningham," Ewan snarled, prying the lockbox open, rusted metal hinges screaming. He withdrew brittle, ruined legal documents Isabel had previously discovered. "Let us thoroughly discuss true fraud. Let us discuss the ruined Glengarry Pass." Ewan threw the damning papers directly onto his heaving chest. "These are original contracts from 1844. True copies. They contain my father's actual signature and highly secret addendums bearing the signature of Lord William Harrington and his silent legal counsel, Charles Cunningham." His pale eyes widened in absolute paralytic horror. His sweaty hands shook terribly. "Did you honestly believe a powerful duke would not keep a completely hidden ledger?" Ewan lied smoothly, weaving an inescapable trap. "These undeniably prove you orchestrated the massive forgery that permanently bankrupted Kinross. You conspired to steal aristocratic lands. That is high treason. If I send these original documents to Lord Aberdeen, you will not merely face a bleak prison. You will surely hang at Newgate." Silence inside the grand hall was suddenly absolute. The arrogant London viper was completely defanged. "The writ," Ewan coldly demanded. Trembling violently, Cunningham produced the official parchment. Ewan walked directly to the massive stone fireplace and confidently tossed the legal writ straight into roaring yellow flames, watching royal law turn to useless grey ash. "Return immediately to London," Ewan ordered, his voice incredibly cold. "Inform magistrates that his contract was void signed under intense duress. Swallow the colossal railway losses yourself. If you ever dare speak the noble name Carmichael again, I will personally deliver these damning papers to Scotland Yard. Get out." Cunningham scrambled pathetically to his feet and fled blindly out heavy doors, diving desperately into his waiting carriage. Wooden wheels spun wildly in thick mud as horses tore out of the damp courtyard. When doors finally slammed shut, silence deafened. Duncan sheathed his sharp sword, nodded respectfully to Isabel, and quietly excused himself, leaving them utterly alone. Ewan stood still by the warm fire. Isabel remained frozen, staring blankly at dying ashes. She was miraculously free. Crushing debts were permanently gone. But a terrible new emptiness suddenly washed entirely over her. She had bargained her very life to securely pay a massive debt. Now cleared, she had no logical reason to stay here. "I suppose, Isabel softly whispered, her delicate voice breaking, "I should promptly pack my wooden trunk. Edward and Mary will be expecting me." Ewan walked purposefully across the vast stone floor, quickly closing the remaining distance. He reached out his strong, calloused hands, gently framing her beautiful face, wiping away a single lingering tear. "You are incredibly intelligent, Isabel," Ewan murmured, piercing blue eyes visibly softening. "But sometimes entirely blind." "Ewan, the debt is truly paid," Ewan gently interrupted. "Past is just ash. Blind vengeance brought me absolutely nothing but 10 long years of bitter, biting cold. You brought radiant fire back to this lonely castle. You bravely saved my innocent people. You completely command my beating heart." He gracefully dropped to one knee, humbly offering himself. "Isabel Harrington," Ewan declared with raw, unfiltered devotion, "I do not want an indentured servant. I want my true equal. Send for Edward and Mary. They will be raised happily here as my cherished family. Stay permanently with me. Marry me. Let us build a legacy of magnificent love." Isabel looked down at the fierce man who had once sworn to ruthlessly destroy her, only to become her magnificent salvation. She fell joyfully to her knees, instantly throwing her arms tightly around his strong neck. Yes, she wept freely. Always forever, yes. Their kiss was a breathtaking triumph. Every great love story demands a fierce battle against the shadows of the past. Did Ewan and Isabel's journey from bitter enemies to passionate equals capture your heart? If you loved this dramatic tale of Highland vengeance, corporate traps and ultimate redemption, please smash that like button, share this story with your fellow historical romance addicts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more sweeping epic tales of forbidden love and dramatic twists. Let us know your favorite moment below.